for President Biden to arrive in Kyiv to meet with President Zelensky, his wife, and discuss the unity and the solid mission of Western unity and the Western allies in the region, their support as the war in Ukraine reaches its 1-year mark in just 2 days from now.
We are waiting for a CBS News special report, and we will carry the president's remarks as soon as he takes the stage there. It was very interesting, the president's arrival in Kyiv just the other day. We heard from the White House that this was absolutely unprecedented to have a president of the United States go into a war zone where U.S. boots were not on the ground.
Right. And, you know, and today is also a quite remarkable day. There's a bit of a split screen that the world is seeing with Putin speaking earlier today, announcing that he's planning to remove Russia or remove his nation from the last nuclear treaty with the United States, although we've heard from Antony Blinken that he was already violating the provisions in that treaty. But it is a significant day to perhaps see how Putin stepped ahead and spoke before seeing President Biden there in Poland today address the allies and continue to solidify the message of support to Ukraine as the U.S. has committed $500 million in aid just this week ahead of what we expect will be a much more aggression from Russia in this 1-year mark of the war.
That's right. There is no end currently in sight for the conflict in Ukraine. Remember, that was an unprovoked attack by Russia on sovereign land there in Ukraine, in part precipitated by Ukraine's desire to join NATO because it felt like there was a Russian threat that was looming. Yeah. Of course, we have seen that play out. We have seen also here in the United States a growing division between some lawmakers. While there are still many Republicans that support the U.S. involvement in Ukraine, we are hearing from a growing number of Republican lawmakers in Washington that want to know the U.S.'s exit strategy and when we are going to stop providing the support. At this point, the White House says that is not part of the consideration, that we stand firmly with Ukraine and that we will continue to support them as President Zelensky there has been calling for increased ammunition, resources, and particularly air defenses. As Russian attacks just continue and become, in the words of many international observers, human rights violations and possibly war crimes.
And, you know, this, as you said, Republicans in Congress are questioning not just the end of the war strategy, but just the funding. This week we're hearing President Biden just, as I mentioned a few seconds ago, committed or said the U.S. is providing more than or around $500 million in aid, $500 million in aid to Ukraine to try and fend off the expected, Russian and increased Russian aggressions in the region. We were just hearing from President Duda in Warsaw, the president of Poland. One of the things that they're marking is, of course, the 1-year anniversary of Russia's what he called brutal invasion of Ukraine. The leaders reflected on their shared efforts to support Ukraine. And of course, there's a lot of conversations around making Poland and other countries in the region or bringing Poland and other countries in the region join NATO.
And, Lilia, you had mentioned earlier the pledge by Russian President Vladimir Putin to try and remove his country from the last remaining nuclear arms treaty that he has with the United States. And we just heard moments ago from the UK's Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, who's urging President Putin to reconsider that decision. Obviously, at the time that those treaties were signed, that signaled a major development in the way that the world superpowers were conducting themselves. And so much of what we have seen in this time period with this conflict has been a reversion to times that seem to be in the rearview mirror of history. And that's part of the reason why this is also concerning.
You know, it has been 12 months, as you said, of just increasing aggressions from Russia, and we're seeing this unity of Western allies, all of this support. But you're right, it seems that, you know, President Putin continues to, first of all, say in his speech earlier today, falsehoods such as that the that it was Poland, it was Ukraine or Western allies who started the war. Right. And of course, in their messaging, in his messaging so far, President Biden and the administration have responded saying, look, if tomorrow Russia retired, the war would be over. And that is proof that this is not something that was started by the West. It's not something that was started by Ukraine. Putin continues to spew notions about Ukrainians, saying that they either want to be a part of Russia or that they are essentially Nazis. I mean, he's been saying all those things, and today had a long speech that was timed on the same day as President Biden's remarks. Who did it first? It's you know, who decided to do it on the first day? What we're hearing from Nancy Cortez's reporting from the White House is that the White House, President Biden, was always intended to speak today, but that Putin was the one who changed the date of his address to coincide. But we're seeing there, you know, a great deal of support. We're seeing American flags, Polish flags, and of course, Ukrainian flags in a show of unity for the allies and support for Ukraine, for the people of Ukraine who continue to suffer, as we see day after day in the reporting of our colleagues like Charlie D'Agata, who's on the ground.
Interesting how jubilant the atmosphere appears there, that we're hearing this type of music that, it sounds like the kind of big band celebrations you would hear on the Capitol lawn here in the United States.
And a stark difference from, what's happening just across the border. And from what we heard today is President Biden, as you said, historically was stepping into the podium or walking by and meeting Zelensky just as air raid sirens were sounding in the background, which is also such a historic moment that none of us will forget. But yeah, what a sharp contrast with this kind of, environment of support, celebration.
And it is interesting, really, to see unity, all of those different flags there. We are waiting, of course, for that special report, and we're going to bring that to you now.
This is a CBS News special report. I'm Norah O'Donnell here in our nation's capital, and we are just moments away from President Biden addressing the world from the Royal Palace Gardens in Warsaw, Poland. You can see the president now walking to the podium. He is going to mark the 1-year anniversary since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Earlier today, the president had bilateral talks with our NATO allies to discuss America's unwavering support of Ukraine. And today's speech, of course, follows that historic visit to Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine. We do expect the president to highlight.
Poland.
Well, let's listen to the president.
One of our great allies, President Duda, Prime Minister, Mr. Mayor, to all the former ministers and presidents, as well as mayors and Polish political leaders from all across the country, thank you for welcoming back to Poland. It was nearly 1 year ago. I spoke at the Royal Castle here in Warsaw, just weeks after Vladimir Putin had unleashed his murderous assault on Ukraine, the largest land war in Europe since World War II had begun. And the principles that have been the cornerstone of peace, prosperity, and stability on this planet for more than 75 years were at risk of being shattered. 1 year ago, the world was bracing for the fall of Kyiv. Well, I just come from a visit to Kyiv, and I can report Kyiv stands strong. Kyiv stands proud, it stands tall, and most important, it stands free. When Russia invaded, it wasn't just Ukraine being tested. The whole world faced a test for the ages. Europe was being tested. America was being tested. NATO was being tested. All democracies are being tested. And the questions we faced were as simple as they were profound. Would we respond, or would we look the other way? Would we be strong, or would we be weak? Would we, all of our allies, would be united or divided? 1 year later, we know the answer. We did respond. We would be strong. We would be united. And the world would not look the other way. We also face fundamental questions about the commitment to the most basic of principles. Would we stand up for the sovereignty of nations? Would we stand up for the right of people to live free from naked aggression? Would we stand up for democracy? 1 year later, we know the answers. Yes, we would stand up for sovereignty, and we did. Yes, we would stand up for the right of people to live free from aggression, and we did. And we would stand up for democracy, and we did. And yesterday, I had the honor to stand with President Zelensky in Kyiv to declare that we will keep standing up for these same things, no matter what. When President Putin ordered his tanks to roll into Ukraine, he thought we would roll over. He was wrong. The Ukrainian people are too brave. America, Europe, a coalition of nations from the Atlantic to the Pacific, we were too unified. Democracy was too strong. Instead of an easy victory he perceived and predicted, Putin left with burnt-out tanks and Russia's forces in disarray. He thought he'd get the Finlandization of NATO. Instead, he got the NATOization of Finland and Sweden. He thought NATO would fracture and divide. Instead, NATO is more united and more unified than ever before. He thought he could weaponize energy to crack your resolve, Europe's resolve. Instead, we're working together to end Europe's dependence on Russian fossil fuels. He thought autocrats like himself were tough and leaders of democracy were soft. And then he met the iron will of America and the nations everywhere that refused to accept the world governed by fear and force. He found himself at war with a nation led by a man whose courage would be forged in fire and steel, President Zelensky. President Putin is confronted with something today that he didn't think was possible a year ago. The democracies of the world have grown stronger, not weaker. But the autocrats of the world have grown weaker, not stronger. Because in the moments of great upheaval and uncertainty, that knowing what you stand for is most important. And knowing who stands with you makes all the difference. The people of Poland know that. You know that. In fact, you know it better than anyone here in Poland. Because that's what solidarity means. Through partition and oppression, when the beautiful city was destroyed after the Warsaw Uprising, during decades under the iron fist of communist rule, Poland endured because you stood together. That's how brave leaders of the opposition and the people of Belarus continue to fight for their democracy. That's how the resolve of Moldovan people, the resolve of the people of Moldova to live in freedom, gained them independence and put them on the path to EU membership. President Sandu is here today. I'm not sure she is, but I'm proud to stand with you and the freedom-loving people of Moldova. Give her a round of applause. 1 year into this war, Putin no longer doubts the strength of our coalition, but he still doubts our conviction. He doubts our staying power. He doubts our continued support for Ukraine. He doubts whether NATO can remain unified. But there should be no doubt. Our support for Ukraine will not waver. NATO will not be divided, and we will not tire. President Putin's craven lust for land and power will fail, and the Ukrainian people's love for their country will prevail. Democracies of the world will stand guard over freedom today, tomorrow, and forever. So that's what's at stake here. Freedom. That's the message I carried to Kyiv yesterday, directly to the people of Ukraine. When President Zelensky said he came to the United States in December, quote, he said, "This struggle will define the world and what our children and grandchildren, how they live, and then their children and grandchildren." He wasn't only speaking about the children and grandchildren of Ukraine. He was speaking about all of our children and grandchildren, yours and mine. We're seeing again today what the people of Poland and the people across Europe saw for decades. Appetites of the autocrat cannot be appeased. They must be opposed. Autocrats only understand one word: no, no, no. No, you will not take my country. No, you will not take my freedom. No, you will not take my future. And I'll repeat tonight what I said last year in this same place. A dictator bent on rebuilding an empire will never be able to ease the people's love of liberty. Brutality will never grind down the will of the free. And Ukraine will never be a victory for Russia. Never. For free people refuse to live in a world of hopelessness and darkness. You know, this has been an extraordinary year in every sense. Extraordinary brutality from Russian forces and mercenaries. They've committed depravities, crimes against humanity, without shame or compunction. They've targeted civilians with death and destruction, used rape as a weapon of war, stolen Ukrainian children in an attempt to steal Ukraine's future, bombed train stations, maternity hospitals, schools, and orphanages. No one can turn away their eyes from the atrocities Russia is committing against the Ukrainian people. It's abhorrent. It's abhorrent. But extraordinarily, as well, has been the response of the Ukrainian people and the world. 1 year after the bombs began to fall, Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine. Ukraine is still independent and free. From Kherson to Kharkiv, Ukrainian fighters have reclaimed their land. More than 50% of the territory Russia held last year. The blue and the yellow flag of Ukraine proudly waves once again. President Zelensky still leads a democratically elected government that represents the will of the Ukrainian people. And the world has already voted multiple times, including the United Nations General Assembly, to condemn Russia's aggression and support a just peace. Each time in the UN, that vote has been overwhelming. In October, 143 nations, the United Nations, condemned Russia's illegal annexation. Only four in the entire UN voted with Russia. 4. So tonight, I speak once more to the people of Russia. The United States and the nations of Europe do not seek to control or destroy Russia. The West was not plotting to attack Russia, as Putin said today. And millions of Russian citizens who only want to live in peace with their neighbors are not the enemy. This war is never a necessity. It's a tragedy. President Putin chose this war. Every day the war continues is his choice. He could end the war with a word. It's simple. If Russia stopped invading Ukraine, it would end the war. If Ukraine stop defending itself against Russia would be the end of Ukraine. That's why together we're making sure Ukraine can defend itself. The United States has assembled a worldwide coalition of more than 50 nations to get critical weapons and supplies to the brave Ukrainian fighters on the front lines. Air defense systems, artillery, ammunition, tanks, armored vehicles. The European Union and its member states have stepped up with unprecedented commitment to Ukraine. Not just in security assistance, but economic and humanitarian refugee assistance and so much more. To all of you here tonight, take a moment, and I'm serious when I say this. Turn around and look at one another. Look at what you've done so far. Poland is hosting more than 1.5 million refugees from this war. God bless you. Poland's generosity, your willingness to open your hearts and your homes is extraordinary. And the American people are united in our resolve as well. All across my country, in big cities and small towns, Ukrainian flags fly from American homes. Over the past year, Democrats and Republicans in our United States Congress have come together to stand for freedom. That's who Americans are, and that's what Americans do. The world is also coming together to address the global fallout from President Putin's war. Putin tried to starve the world, blocking the ports in the Black Sea to stop Ukraine from exporting its grain, exacerbating the global food crisis that hit developing nations in Africa especially hard. Instead, the United States and the G7 and partners around the world answered the call with historic commitments to address the crisis and to bolster global food supplies. And this week, my wife, Jill Biden, is traveling to Africa to help bring attention to this critical issue. Our commitment is to the people of Ukraine and the future of Ukraine, a Ukraine that's free, sovereign, and democratic. That was the dream of those who declared Ukraine's independence more than 30 years ago, who led the Orange Revolution and the Revolution of Dignity, who braved ice and fire in the Maidan, and the Heavenly Hundred who died there, and those who continue still to root out Kremlin's efforts to corrupt, coerce, and control. It's a dream for those Ukrainian patriots who fought for years against Russia's aggressions in the Donbass, and the heroes who've given everything, given their lives in the service of their beloved Ukraine. I was honored to visit their memorial in Kyiv yesterday to pay tribute to the sacrifice of those who lost their lives, standing alongside President Zelensky. The United States and our partners stand with Ukraine's teachers, its hospital staff, its emergency responders, the workers in cities across Ukraine are fighting to keep the power on in the face of Russia's cruel bombardment. We stand with the millions of refugees of this war who found a welcome in Europe and the United States, particularly here in Poland. Ordinary people all across Europe did whatever they could to help and continue to do so. Polish businesses, civil society, cultural leaders, including the First Lady of Poland, who is here tonight, have led with the heart and determination, showcasing all that's good about the human spirit. Madam First Lady, we love you. Thank you all. I'll never forget last year visiting with refugees from Ukraine who had just arrived in Warsaw, seeing their faces, exhausted and afraid, holding their children so close, worrying they might never see their fathers, their husbands, their brothers, their sisters again. In that darkest moment of their lives, you, the people of Poland, offered them safety and light. You embraced them. You literally embraced them. I watched the looks on their faces. Meanwhile, together we made sure that Russia is paying the price for its abuses. We continue to maintain the largest sanction regime ever imposed in any country in history. and we're going to announce more sanctions this week together with our partners. We'll hold accountable those who are responsible for this war, and we'll seek justice for the war crimes and crimes against humanity continuing to be committed by the Russians. You know, there is much for us to be proud of over all that we have achieved together this past year. But we have to be honest and clear-eyed as we look at the year ahead. The defense of freedom is not the work of a day or of a year. It's always difficult. It's always important. As Ukraine continues to defend itself against the Russian onslaught and launch counteroffensive of its own, there will continue to be hard and very bitter days, victories and tragedies. But Ukraine is steel for the fight ahead. And the United States, together with our allies and partners, are going to continue to have Ukraine's back as it defends itself. Next year, I will host every member of NATO for our 2024 summit in the United States. Together, we'll celebrate the 75th anniversary of the strongest defensive alliance in the history of the world, NATO. And let there be no doubt, the commitment of the United States to our NATO alliance and Article 5 is rock solid. And every member of NATO knows it. And Russia knows it as well. An attack against one is an attack against all. It's a sacred oath. Sacred oath to defend every inch of NATO territory. Over the past year, the United States has come together with our allies and partners in an extraordinary coalition to stand against Russian aggression. But the work in front of us is not just what we're against. It's about what we're for. What kind of world do we want to build? We need to take the strength and capacity of this coalition and apply it to lifting up the lives of people everywhere, improving health, growing prosperity, preserving the planet, building peace and security, treating everyone with dignity and respect. That's our responsibility. The democracies of the world have to deliver it for our people. As we gather tonight, the world, in my view, is at an inflection point. The decisions we make over the next 5 years or so are going to determine and shape our lives for decades to come. That's true for Americans. It's true for the people of the world. And while decisions are ours to make now, the principles and the stakes are eternal. The choice between chaos and stability, between building and destroying, between hope and fear, between democracy that lifts up the human spirit and the brutal hand of the dictator who crushes it, between nothing less than limitation and possibilities. The kind of possibilities that come when people who live not in captivity but in freedom. 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 There is no sweeter word than freedom. There is no nobler goal than freedom. There's no higher aspiration than freedom. Americans know that, and you know it. And all that we do now must be done so our children and grandchildren will know it as well. Freedom. The enemy of the tyrant and the hope of the brave and the truth of the ages. Freedom. Stand with us. We will stand with you. Let us move forward with faith and conviction and with an abiding commitment to be allies, not of darkness but of light, not of oppression but of liberation, not of captivity but, yes, of freedom. May God bless you all. May God protect our troops. And may God bless the heroes of Ukraine and all those who defend freedom around the world. Thank you, Poland. Thank you, thank you, thank you for what you're doing. God bless you all.
Well, powerful remarks from President Biden in Poland. In these remarks here, standing before what is an estimated 30,000 people in Warsaw with a message to the world that democracy will win, freedom will prevail, and that autocracies like those run by Vladimir Putin will fail. The president saying also that the world is at an inflection point. This is something the president believes very firmly, that what happens in the next 5 years will determine global prosperity and peace for the coming decades. Let's bring in our senior White House and political correspondent, Ed O'Keefe, because he is right there outside the Royal Palace Gardens, a remarkable crowd there. And Ed, the president making clear that the U.S. and NATO will stand firmly with Ukraine.
That's right, Nora. Just as he was finishing his speech, you could hear church bells in the distance, as it's just after 6 o'clock here in Warsaw tonight. The office of the mayor tells us about 30,000 people are here to hear from President Biden, who's greeting children on stage right now as he wraps up his remarks. Aides said that he was eager to be here today to give these remarks, a follow-up to a more somber address he gave last March, right here in the same location, that speech where he called, whether purposely or accidentally, for the removal of Vladimir Putin. And his address today comes on the same day that Putin addressed his country in their equivalent of the State of the Union address, blaming the West for the war in Ukraine and saying that they would withdraw from the last nuclear non-proliferation treaty with the United States. The president tonight directly addressing that one claim that the U.S. wants to invade Russia and started this war, saying it's not true. Aides had said they might tweak the speech to respond to the Russian leader ever so slightly, but that otherwise it would be, once again, a defense of American ideals and democracy, freedom, sovereignty all around the world. This, of course, comes the day after he visited Kyiv in that dramatic visit to meet with President Zelensky and vow at least another $500 million in U.S. assistance. He met earlier today with the Polish president, vowing once again to defend the eastern flank of NATO, and he'll meet with other leaders of Eastern Europe tomorrow as this trip continues. Nora.
Ed O'Keefe describing that all so well. And as you mentioned, the president perhaps changing his remarks at just the last minute to respond to President Putin today, delivering a message directly to the Russian people in his words, saying we don't want control or we don't want to attack Russia. This was never a war of necessity. It is a tragedy, in his words. Putin chose this war. Ed O'Keefe, thank you so much. I want to bring in our senior foreign correspondent, Charlie D'Agata. He is in Kyiv, Ukraine. Charlie, I know you were there when the president made that dramatic and historic visit to Ukraine's capital yesterday. The president making clear in this speech that the U.S. and NATO will stand firm with the people of Ukraine. And of course, the world has pledged tons of military aid, billions of dollars. But is it everything that the Ukrainians want?
Nor, yes, we were here. We were in the room at the presidential palace when President Biden stood right beside President Zelensky, and there is no more powerful symbol of unity than that. But yes, this will be music to the ears of many Ukrainians just to see the international support. Some of what he said, Kyiv stands strong. He said that yesterday. In honor of standing beside President Zelensky, he said, a man forged in fire and steel. Our support for Ukraine will never waver. Ukraine will never be a victory for Russia. Yes, Ukrainians here, they want to hear that support. They want to hear the $500 million military aid package. It's about democracy and sovereignty. Mostly it's about winning this war. It's entered a difficult and dangerous phase for Ukrainians. So, yes, when they see President Biden standing there in front of the American flag, in front of the Polish flag, in front of the Ukrainian flag, a day after he made that unannounced visit here, it shows support for this country as they fight in this battle against Russia.
Charlie D'Agata, thank you. The president saying that Kyiv stands strong, as you mentioned, stands proud, it stands tall, and most important, it stands free. Still, the Ukrainians asking for warplanes from the U.S. and NATO allies, also asking for long-range missiles that could hit inside of Russia. They have not yet received that support, but are getting tanks that are expected to be on the way, some of those coming this spring. Our coverage is going to continue on CBS News, streaming your local news, and we will have a full wrap-up tonight right here on the CBS Evening News. This has been a CBS News Special Report. I'm Nora O'Donnell.
You have been watching a CBS News special report of President Biden's speech in Poland ahead of the one-year observance of the Russian invasion in Ukraine. The president made the trip after making an unannounced visit to Kyiv, visiting Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. He announced more sanctions against Russia later this week, and though he warned that there will continue to be hard and bitter days ahead, the U.S. and allies will continue to have Ukraine's back, and that Ukraine will never be a victory for Russia.
A particularly strong line, that one. The president also reiterated his support for Ukraine, just shy of that one-year mark of the Russian invasion, in front of an audience of about 30,000 people. Biden recalled the dire predictions at the start of the war, saying 1 year ago the world braced for the fall of Kyiv, but after having just visited there, he continued to say today that Kyiv stands strong. Mr. Biden also pledged an end to the reliance on Russian fossil fuels and praised his hosts, the people and leaders of Poland, for their role in welcoming 1.5 million Ukrainian refugees and another 8 million international refugees that passed through those borders.
CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe joins us now from Warsaw, Poland. Ed, I mean, one of the things that really struck me was the announcement that there's going to be more sanctions. Of course, that has been an ongoing thing from the White House. But what are the main takeaways that you've gathered from Biden's speech?
Well, Lilia and Lana, this was designed to be yet another attempt by President Biden to speak out against autocracies, to speak out against Vladimir Putin's decision to mount this war in Ukraine. And the contrast between what he's doing and saying here tonight versus what he did and said here in this same spot last March couldn't be more night and day. This is an American-style political rally. I mean, you can hear Foo Fighters playing behind me. Earlier it was Jill Scott, Stevie Wonder, Beyonce, and Carole King in what is an otherwise pretty somber setting. The Royal Palace Gardens have been here since the 1590s. It's an example of Polish resistance and resiliency through conflicts throughout the centuries. But the president eager to be here again in Eastern Europe to reiterate America's commitment to the conflict, to remind Eastern Europe that it stands with its NATO partners against potential Russian aggression. And on the same day that the Russian leader is delivering his address to the country there and accusing the United States of wanting to invade Russia and starting the war in Ukraine, the president rewriting his speech there in the final moments to say absolutely not, that is not the case. And Vladimir Putin himself could end all of this by withdrawing his troops. But a dramatic scene here in Warsaw tonight. The mayor's office says about 30,000 people were here, Polish citizens, Ukrainian refugees. The president of Moldova came for this address. The Polish President Duda introduced President Biden, and others who live here in Poland eager to attend. Young and old American diplomats who work at the embassy and other civil society groups, volunteers from the United States who are headed to the Polish-Ukrainian border to work with refugees also here in attendance tonight.
Yeah, and I thought one of the standout lines was when Mr. Biden said, speaking of Putin, he could end the war with a word, just a word. On that note, we want to bring in senior foreign correspondent Charlie D'Agata. He is there in Kyiv. Charlie, on this point about Russia, how are they responding to President Biden's trip to Eastern Europe, especially given that his speech came the same day as Russian President Vladimir Putin's national address? I imagine there's going to be additional comments from Russian leaders, given how forcefully President Biden took on President Putin just now.
Yes, it's become a day of dueling speeches. And as you said, we had President Biden here standing side by side with President Zelensky right at the presidential palace. We were at the presidential palace when that happened yesterday. There's no stronger sign of unity with the people of Ukraine. And this is a rallying cry internationally. Now, there hasn't been a direct response from President Putin in his address today, but he was certainly going after the West. He blamed Ukraine for starting the war. He blamed the West for starting the war. Blamed the West for escalating it in terms of long-range weapons that have been bringing in, saying if these weapons are used in the battlefield, we have no choice but to push them away from Russian territory and Russian-held territory. So he's going straight after the United States and the West. But in terms of support here, as you heard him say, he admired President Zelensky, a man, as he said, forged in fire and steel. He said, our support will not waver. Ukraine will never be a victory for Russia. So certainly President Biden directly aiming that at President Putin and Russia going just a few hours earlier, President Putin himself taking aim at the West and Ukraine for not only starting this conflict, but for escalating it.
Yeah, I mean, and it didn't seem like there was an indirect communication, not a direct one. We didn't hear from Biden anything about the suspension of the START treaty. But Charlie, you've been covering this war from day one. What happens next as we approach 1 year since the war began in Ukraine? What part will the U.S. be playing moving forward, especially after we're hearing of this $500 million commitment, further sanctions, et cetera?
Yeah, well, you know, when we've spoken to commanders, local commanders in the early days of the war, I think we have to remind ourselves that the Russians were able to advance to within 14, 15 miles outside of Kyiv. It was everybody's estimation that Kyiv itself would fall within 96 hours. A lot of that was coming out of intelligence in the United States. That's what triggered that mass refugee crisis. They have clawed back those neighborhoods. We went there. We've been there the past couple of days. These great victories for Ukrainian forces as they pushed Russia away from the capital itself and regained the territory that Russia had taken along the east. But I can tell you that Russia is clawing back. They have the ammunition. They have the manpower, most importantly. Hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers, new conscripts who are going to be flooding into this battlefield. They're in it for the long haul, and they've got the kind of resources to do that. So the Ukrainians right now are saying, yes, we need these weapon systems. We need long-range weapon systems. They're obviously calling for the tanks. They're serious when they talk about F-16 fighter jets. We spoke with the defense minister, Alexei Reznikov. He said, absolutely, we're serious about that. We need to cripple Russia's air defense systems here. So we are entering a difficult and dangerous phase of this conflict. The front lines are sort of static. They're going back and forth in some cases by feet by the day. You've seen the onslaught in Bakhmut in the east. The Russians are pushing in areas just east of Kharkiv, areas that the Ukrainian forces have been able to successfully push them out. They need weapons, they need ammunition, and they need it now. So there have been great platitudes, and they'll be listening to today's speech about democracy and sovereignty and freedom and protecting Western values. But when it comes down to the nitty-gritty, they need weapons, they need them quickly.
Right. We heard those platitudes. We heard also President Biden's additional commitment. The U.S. has given more aid than any other nation. Interestingly, the AP was reporting, though, that when you look at a proportion of the GDP, actually, it's the former Soviet republics of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania that have given the greatest proportion of funds there. Ed, you have heard a lot of speeches from President Biden. In this case, he was not that folksy president we often see, but he was really a forceful call for additional aid and support. But as you know, the White House is trying to navigate Republican pushback when it comes to the war effort. How do they do that now, and does this speech help him?
Officials are conscious of that and said that... Now go. Sorry, Lillian, Lana, a little hard to hear here. The question about Republican concerns or growing opposition to the military conflict. There are polls this week that show growing, if not opposition, at least ambivalence to the conflict here. The White House is conscious of that, said that part of why the president wanted to speak today was to reiterate or reinforce to a domestic audience the importance of this conflict and standing with Ukraine. But there has been growing calls by at least some Republicans, a vocal minority, however, in Congress, saying that funding for this has to be reconsidered. We should remember, in the last 5 days or so, there have been at least 3 major delegations of lawmakers in both parties attending a European security conference in Munich and then going on to other places across this part of the world to reiterate American support for the conflict and try to build support for it among other Western nations.
All right. Well, to the tune of Queen there, Ed O'Keefe and Charlie D'Agata, thank you so much for all of this insight.
Thanks. Well, Russia is pulling out of its last nuclear treaty with the U.S. President Vladimir Putin made the announcement during his State of the Nation address earlier today.
The speech also addressed the war in Ukraine, of course, in which Putin slammed the West for the war and praised Russian forces.
Mary Ilyushina joins us now from Latvia to talk more about Putin's address. Mary, describe for us the tone of his overall address and what he had to say about the war effort.
Well, Vladimir Putin said this is a war for survival, that Russia's hand was forced against the United States and